Hi, Whitney.
Hello.
Thank you for talking to us. I just want you to be really informal and talk about PBL.
Okay.
But first, I want you to tell everybody who you are.
I am Whitney Neal. I'm an 8th grade U.S. History teacher at PBL Middle School East. I teach GT and pre-AP classes, and I also work with all of our teachers as department head on our campus.
Okay, so I just want you to talk about PBL in general, and then we'll be a little bit more specific. I know that you've done PBL for about 4 years, but tell us, what's your objective in teaching with PBL? Because right now you're not required to do that.
Correct.
So what's your objective?
When I started looking at PBL, what excited me the most was that it taught the kids to think. And it gave them the opportunity to think and fail and retry and grow as a person through the process. Because I think that one of the things our kids are really missing is that critical thinking component to history and to their lessons. And I wanted to give them that opportunity. And I feel like this was a great way to do it.
Okay. So you said you teach GT and pre-AP.
Yes.
And do you have what we might consider regular ed students in there? Do you have any special ed or ESL, or what do you have?
I have kids that are 504. I have a good portion of our 8th grade ESL population signs up for pre-AP or GT. And then I also have students that fall under special education for various reasons. So we have all three.
Okay, so, but they still do the PBL project?
Yes, and my teaching partner that is right next door to me, he has all on-level classes, and when we design a plan together, we plan something that he can use and I can use at the same time. They may look a little different, the final products and expectations may be a little different, but the process is the same.
Okay, so tell me how you and your partner is Wes.
Yes.
Right.
Wes.
Tell me how you and Wes come up with your project ideas. I know the district has a scope and sequence, and the other 8th grade teachers in the district may not be using PBL.
Correct.
I think most of them are not.
Most of them are
not.
not.
So how do you kind of reconcile that and stick with the scope and sequence of the district and still come up with project ideas?
I think when you look at the scope and sequence for the district, you can kind of automatically identify areas that PBL would work, looking at the concepts that we have our scope and sequence divided up in. The idea of revolution, the idea of colonizing. We actually sit down together and kind of look at what do we want the kids to get out of this unit. So let's put the factual content aside. What's the general idea that kids should walk out of our classes with? For colonization, it's that people make decisions for a reason. What convinces people to make these decisions? Why would you move halfway around the world to a new place of the unknown? Those big thoughts and big questions guide us down into developing a project. So we kind of use those guiding questions and essential questions to get our mind ready to write a project. Okay.
So in some places they call that the driving question, but you were talking about the same thing, the essential question of it. Okay. So when you design your project that way, I know you put resources in the project that are some of the facts and information. So how do you guarantee that your students are getting the facts that we have traditionally wanted to be sure they're getting?
We do it through several ways. Sometimes the kids don't even realize we're doing it. There's an element to the project design, whether it's a status report or a status check, or whether we have the kids. One of the projects that we do is a marketing project with our Marketing the 13 Colonies. Well, those groups actually periodically come in and debate specific things, whether it's how did geography affect the economy, and through those experiences, through reflections, through short little quizzes, we get that information from them. They don't even realize half the time they're being assessed on that knowledge, because they'll say, oh my gosh, and they've got all this information, but the kids will hold themselves accountable to learn that, to come to the answer of your guiding question. Because if the question is framed correctly and the project is framed, they're going to learn that in their attempt to answer the question.
So this is not something we had talked about before, but I know every teacher worries about, yes, the majority of my students will learn that as they get there, but there are some students who don't.
Yes.
And so maybe I know that on my status check or my benchmark, whatever that's called, and maybe I don't know that until the end of the project, but when you have a student whom you can tell hasn't gotten it, what do you do?
You know, they will often self-identify that through the project by coming to you and saying, I'm lost, I'm not going to get that. That's when you sit down and instead of having a group workshop, you have a one-on-one workshop with that child. Or, you know, you say, you know, here's some extra resources, here's some scaffolding activities that will help you get to this information. You're not going to have every kid in the class do the same activities through the project. Maybe you've got that, you know, matrix or a chart that the child can fill in as they're looking for the information. A lot of times the kids that are struggling to get the information are kids that haven't been taught how to organize information. And so, you know, it's just the overwhelmed, I don't know where to start, I'm not getting it because I didn't, you know, write anything down. You can kind of help the kid develop those skills along the way and give them tools to learn that information as they go. But the important thing is not to hand it to them. You don't want to say, oh, well, you didn't learn it here, I'm just going to give you this packet that has all the answers in it. You still want to teach that child how to get to the place all the other kids are.
So you mentioned you might give them an organizational tool or a chart or something like that, and you know which students need those.
Yes.
I know often ESL kids do.
Yes.
Some students with IEPs, we know they need those. But you wouldn't just give that to the whole class.
No.
And I know that you wouldn't, but that's part of the process of learning how not to do that. So we'll talk about that in a little bit.
Okay.
But if I forget, remind me that we want to talk to you about that. Okay. So I know that you may not call things the same thing that everybody else does, but you get this project idea and then you create a launch idea. And I wanted to ask you about that, like how do you try to make every launch idea something that is actually realistic, and how do you do that?
I think you have to, because you're asking a lot of the kids through the process. So if you can draw them in and make them feel involved in the project in some way, then you lose a lot at the beginning. So you have to make them feel invested in it from day one. So you build an element that they are truly interested in solving a problem or in creating a solution. And so yes, I definitely try it. We call those entry events.
Right.
So with every entry event, I try to think, okay, what would make me excited about this? What would I be invested in, or what would get a boy, an athletic boy, and also, the most quiet and shy girl in the room to both be invested in working on this project, and then presenting it in a way that is exciting to them. So something real world.
So let me ask you about that. So it's a real world scenario, but they may not be like we're having a video competition to launch a new TV series, for example. And that's not really going to happen.
Correct.
But it's a real world scenario.
Yes.
How do you get the kids, once they've done several, they know that it's not going to really happen. How do you get them to still be interested?
There's the element of competition, which helps with any project. And also, there's class rewards. I do work off of a reward system as far as, in my classroom is different. Maybe I give them, like a homework, well, we don't have homework, but like a pass where they get a freebie or something. Maybe it's a free iPod day. Or maybe it's you get to do this for a day. Maybe it's your whole group gets to lay on the floor with my cuddle pillows, for the whole week after. Even the littlest incentive will make them want to compete.
Okay.
A lot of times I'll just do, the winning team gets to pick their favorite drink from Sonic, and oh my goodness, and that's all you hear the whole time is, but I want a purple, whatever from Sonic. And
so you actually bring rewards to the classroom?
Yes, absolutely. And then, sometimes the PTO or other groups, when they find out about that, they'll come to you and say, oh my goodness, can we help out? Well, could we purchase a reward for this project? And if you really look at the grand scheme of a project, they last a while. It's not like the teacher's going to be buying a lot of prizes.
Okay, so let's talk about knows and need to knows for a minute. We do the knows and the need to knows from the beginning. Sometimes the things that are on need to know for the student are a lot about, well, how do I use this tool and what's that product going to look like, but they don't get to the actual learning that's there.
That's true.
So how often do you use their knows and need to knows? How often do they revisit them, revise them, and how do you do that?
When I first went to training, I was told we should look at them every day, which in an ideal classroom would happen. But, we're working with middle school kids, and we know time is valuable. I do it every other day of the project. So we do it on day one, and then I do it, we'll have a day where maybe they're doing a workshop, whatever, but every other day at least we'll revisit that for the first 10 to 15 minutes of class. I'm digital, but on a no need to know, I use a huge piece of picture paper for every class. I keep them rolled up, and I pull it out. They actually do one on Google Docs that matches mine on the wall. So they have their own, and they're held accountable at the end of the project that theirs looks like ours. But that way, they're typing it in. So when they realize they have a question, they're like, okay, well, today's Tuesday, so tomorrow's Wednesday. We're going to be looking at our chart. I'm going to save that question for tomorrow. But those charts build your workshops. They build your rubric. It helps you know how to guide the kids, so they're invaluable.
Okay, so that's a little bit of a different mind shift. And I remember when I first started, that was hard for me because I know what I think they need to be doing on Wednesday and Thursday and Friday. But if the need to know doesn't show they need to be doing that, then what do you do?
Sometimes, you still have a classroom when you're doing a PBL, and so if I realize we haven't got to something important, I may have a question on the board when they walk in, so my warm-up for that day might be, hey, have y'all thought about this, and what would your answers be? And a lot of times it's a question that'll lead them to look at the other thing they haven't added to the need to know.
Okay.
So that question will guide them to another question, hopefully, if it works right.
Okay. And we'll get back to that in a minute. Do you use critical friends?
Yes.
And how do you use that?
It's hard on my campus because there aren't a lot of people who do this. So I actually will contact teachers at another school in our district that also use project-based learning. As for their entire campus, they use it. And so I've worked with teachers there, and then I actually have asked kids to evaluate the project, and I use their feedback for the next year. So my projects that I started with several years ago look very different today because of that process over time. Okay,
so you don't just depend on experts to do that then?
The kids give the best feedback.
And do the kids do critical friends with each other on their projects and products?
They do. Built into every project is status reports where they self-evaluate on a weekly basis. So they write a reflection on themselves and also the performance of their team members. And then I try to take those evaluations and I give the kids a copy with maybe 5 or 10 statements. This is where your team thinks that you're at on the project with what you've submitted to the project so far. There are no names. They don't have an idea. There's motivators and suggestions for improvement. They get those along the way. And then during, we have like a run-through day, a practice day for presentations, and we also have the presentation day. They're evaluating the other team, and they're saying, this was great. It would have been even better if you had tried this, or did you ask this question?
Right. Okay.
And so they get a lot of feedback.
And then they have time to revise their project.
They do. They have time to come back. Their grade isn't final until, they've had the chance to come back and say, I took that and now I want to show you what else I can do. That doesn't mean you're going to have another huge day of presentations, but it gives those kids who want to improve the opportunity to go back and do that.
Okay, so let's talk about benchmarks for a minute. You call them status checks. What types of things, you talked a little bit about that before, but what different styles of things to use as benchmarks?
The big one I use is self-reflection. As far as the kids reflecting, and they have some guiding questions that guide their self-reflection. You learn the most about what they think of the process. They talk about what they've learned that week, what they've accomplished that week, and how what they've learned affects what they're doing, their final product. But I also do, quizzes are still, I do quizzes, I'll do a vocab game, a vocab check. Sometimes, you may have people that are involved in the project as far as your TEKs may give you, they need to know from this time period, Ben Franklin, John Adams, whoever. We'll have a game they have to go on and play, or a form they fill out in Google Docs, and it just sends me a formative assessment where I can go in and say, okay, good, they all kind of knew what person went with what description. It's not for a grade, but it was my formative assessment for that information. And then they actually will have, a lot of times they'll make the content due, several days before the presentation, and so before they finalize the product, I've gone and looked at their content, whether it was a website that they've made with information or some technological product, and I've made sure they got it right and given it back to them for improvement before they ever present it.
Right. So they're not presenting something.
Correct. And yeah, they're not getting up there talking about something that's totally wrong.
Yeah, I can remember I had a project before PBL, and the girl had Martin Luther, and her entire presentation was on Martin Luther King Jr.
Oh.
And so, yeah, I learned from that point to check ahead of time.
Check before.
Okay, so here's what I think we need the most.
Okay.
All right. So you're in a project. Let's pretend it's a 3-week project. It's 2-3 weeks. But
in the middle of fun right now?
What are you doing right now?
They are creating their own adventure on the road to the revolution. And
Okay.
so, well, that's what the GT kids are doing. They had the freedom to create an adventure for an individual traveling the road to the revolution. So perhaps they created a southern plantation owner, or maybe it was a New England merchant, and they're going to tell me the story of this person as they experience from the proclamation of 1763. Maybe they start at the French and Indian War. It's their freedom to do that, all the way through the Declaration of Independence. And it's their job to decide how it affects that individual, and then how their situation or scenario compares to other lifestyles throughout the 13 colonies. Maybe belief systems, if they're a loyalist or a patriot, different, people in New England had more impacts than people in the South, that kind of thing. But they have the total freedom to design what that looks like.
Okay, so that's where you get the choice.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so you're in this 3-week project, and you're the facilitator. How much percentage-wise of your time do you spend in what we might call direct teach? But I don't mean just lecture. I mean you are controlling the whole class that day.
Ooh, I think when you start PBL, you really have to transform the idea that you're not teaching, you're facilitating, and so 100% of your time is spent doing that. My work, I would say, during the time of the project, 40 to 45% is workshops with, and again, they have the choice to come to the workshops. They do choose to come, but where there is some sort of direct instruction going on, but it's rarely, even in that scenario, it's rarely lecture, because when you lecture, you're still handing them information, you're not teaching the tools on how to find it. So that's the real challenge of PBL, is challenging yourself as a teacher to design things where you're not handing information, you're guiding them on how to find it.
Right.
But I'd say 45 to 50.
And how much of that time is whole class? Because you do workshops, I know you do them a lot, and you'll pull kids or they'll choose to come. Do you ever do whole class workshops?
Yes. If we have gotten to the point in the project where I realize, well, I've got to put the brakes on this, everyone is, off on a tangent, we'll pull in and we'll do a whole group workshop. But that's going to be more on the project.
Okay.
What is this? What are we doing? What is the goal here? Let's go back and look at it.
Not on the content.
Not on the content. Let's go back and relook at that no need to know chart and regroup as a team. Through that, the content will come out, because they're going to start saying, well, I thought this was this and this was this, and that will come out. But as far as a required whole class workshop, it's rare. But the kids choose to come to those workshops. So a lot of times the whole class will come in.
Yeah.
Yes, but it's not that I said you must attend this on Benjamin Franklin and the Enlightenment, so be here. It's, hey, I'm going to talk about some really cool things Ben Franklin did during the Enlightenment. You might want to hear it, and of course, I'm like, oh, okay,
Yeah.
So they learn, hey, I better go to that.
Yeah.
And so they'll attend.
Okay. And so I think you kind of addressed, so how often do you have workshops? Sometimes every day?
Sometimes every day. And that'll depend on class, because first period, they're going to get, X, Y, and Z, and they're not going to need a workshop. But fifth period's not going to get a darn thing they're supposed to find out. And so you may do workshops every day with fifth period, but every 3 days with first period.
Okay.
And so you don't have to.
And you know that based on your need to know.
And just when you're not in a workshop, you're working with individual groups of students, and so through that work where you're listening to them talk and you're watching them work, you're learning, oh, they're kind of off on this. I need to do a workshop on this, and it may just be for that group.